Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be. My name is Sean, and I'm delighted you're joining us for today's ESBC community webinar. Today, I am joined by Changa Banda, who will cover Unlocking Insights, an introduction to Microsoft Fabric's end-to-end analytics solution. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESBC_community, and our hashtag is hashtag ESBC24. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, End-to-End Fabric Solution with Clive Lemon. This webinar takes place Thursday, 11th of July, 2024 at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. CEST. For more information on this webinar, please check out www.sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. Exciting news! The ESBC 24 program is out now. Get ready for 100 plus sessions covering all your favorite Microsoft 365 topics, from governance to Azure, AI security, and much more. Our fantastic program team has created top-notch content to boost your knowledge. Join us in Stockholm for the stellar event. Book your ticket today at www.sharepointeurope.com/pricing. Get ready to dive in a day filled with insights, inspiration, and innovation. Don't miss out on a chance to connect with industry experts and acquire the skills necessary for success. Save the date because EPBC is right around the corner, taking place next month. Exciting news! Introducing the European Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. Mark your calendars for September 24th to the 27th for an experience packed with workshops, keynotes, and breakout sessions led by Microsoft experts. Explore the latest trends in Microsoft Fabric, including Azure AI and Microsoft Purview. Don't miss out. Register your interest today at sharepointeurope.com/European Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. After this webinar, we'll have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have into the questions box. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by the email when it is available. And now, I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Chenga. Hello, Chenga. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, everyone.
So I just made you presenter there. If you want to share your screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I can see if you just want to put it in presentation mode, yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to go back and forth. I think
No problem at all.
I'm having some technical difficulties at the moment. Just bear with me. Let me just reshare this.
Yeah, so I can see the presentation there.
Okay, fantastic. Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see that. Perfect.
Okay, great. So welcome everyone to the Fabric session. I really hope this is going to be, I'd say interactive, and I hope it's going to be interesting as well. So I'm just going to touch over just an overview of what Fabric is, what it can do for you, and just, I'll say some exciting things. So I get really excited about Fabric, so you might have to slow me down if I start to get ahead of myself. So on that note, I'll just go to our next slide. Okay, so we'll start off with our starting line, which is before Microsoft Fabric. And just, I think, if we just take back 5 years ago, 5 years, 3 years ago, this was typically what you would see. So you typically have your team that handles the data engineering side, you have your data scientists, and then you have your analysts. And so what that tends to look like if you have an Azure ecosystem is you tend to have, say, maybe an Azure storage where you have your files, and then you connect your Azure storage to maybe Synapse, so Azure Synapse Analytics, and then from that connection you take it into Power BI. But at the same time, you might need to create some materialized views and all of these different configurations, which can become very confusing quite quickly. And at the same time, I think it also makes it a bit more complex because you might find when you're trying to connect Synapse Analytics with Power BI, there's some networking restrictions, there's some permissions you need to factor in. There's so much that goes behind the scenes. And so this is typically what we would see. But across the board, we saw that there was a need for data engineers, data scientists, and analysts, and our citizen developers or the consumers of those reports to be in the loop and to have that back and forth feedback with each other. And I think one thing as well to point out is just the fact that when it came to copying data across the board as well, sometimes it might be inefficient. So sometimes the data might be stale, sometimes you've got troubles trying to convert the data to this particular format to be consumed in this file. And so we just, I guess, took those patterns and decided to create something from it. So if you already have the Microsoft ecosystem, like I mentioned before, you might be familiar with some of these terms, which is the Microsoft storage accounts, Azure Synapse Analytics, Data Factory, Power BI, all of these great things. So what we did with Microsoft Fabric was we integrated all of these things into one place. So this is a centralized place for you to access all of your data, for you to build reports off of, for you to clean your data, cleanse your data, prepare your data for machine learning as well. And at the same time, all of this is built with Microsoft governance and security in place and in mind. Let's go to the next slide. So, like I mentioned before, we had our multiple different analytics services. So we had machine learning, which was disparate to Power BI, which was disparate to your storage account. And then we had disconnected data sources and also isolated applications. So what you would find is if you are trying to bring in some generative AI into your solution as well, you might struggle trying to bring in that particular, I would say, solution and integrating it with your existing platform. So for instance, if we are using Synapse Analytics and you're trying to connect it to could be any Azure Cognitive Service, you might struggle or you might encounter some permissions problems, nothing to do with the tools per se, all to do with, so sorry, is the screen still sharing just fine? Just cautious.
Everything's working perfectly. Well done.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just mindful, when things do pop up on the side, are you able to see the things that pop up on the side, or is it just me?
Yeah, I don't see things popping up. No.
Okay, that's perfect. I
Yeah.
was worried it was disturbing.
No problem.
Okay, that's great. So what we do have now with Fabric is we have this centralized place where we have generative AI built inside of it. We can also connect it to some of our resources, our different AI resources. We have data in one place. And all of this, I would say, centralized around this one lake approach, which is, I like to call it the OneDrive of the cloud because it is essentially like the OneDrive of the cloud. So this brings us to our solution. So which is we have this new era of analytics where you no longer have to go about connecting this, provisioning this, because what would happen is maybe you would have to deploy a Synapse workspace and then connect it to something else and then find a connector. No, with Microsoft Fabric, you have one platform where you can do all of these different things. So you have Data Factory, which is data ingestion. You've got data engineering, which is predominantly your cleansing of your data. And then you have your data warehousing, similar to what we see with Azure Synapse Analytics, where we can actually cleanse our data, clean our data, run some queries over it. We have data science. So if you've used Azure Machine Learning, you'll be familiar with this data science type of work space. And then we also have real-time intelligence as well, which is, if you've used real-time analytics before, very similar to that. The only difference is it's more efficient because it's obviously been built on this one unified platform. And then we have our all-time favorite, Power BI. So all of these things in one platform. This is why Microsoft Fabric really gets me excited, because when I think about the fact that just 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we had to create each of these different resources. And I remember trying to connect my Azure Synapse Analytics and Power BI, and how it took us some time to connect it. The integration was fine, but it just took us some time. But now with Fabric, you have your one copy of your, it could be model, you have your one copy of your data, and it's going through each and every single stage. You don't need to you don't need to copy the document over, you don't need to copy the file over. It's just there in this one centralized place for you. And so when we talk about Microsoft Fabric, these are the four main pillars that ground Microsoft Fabric. So we have the complete analytics platform. So like I mentioned before, you have everything inside there. You have Data Factory, you have Azure Machine Learning, you have access to all of these different services. At the same time, it is lake-centric and open. And when we say open lake-centric, we mean you can bring in data from your different data sources as well. And we'll talk about shortcuts in a minute. And it's also centralized around this lake approach. So we talked about, or I briefly touched on the fact that one lake is similar to OneDrive, and I'll show you how that is. You also get to empower every business user, and it's also AI powered at its core. So if we just go through the first one, which is just the complete analytics platform, we saw everything is already there. You don't need to deploy anything. You don't need to provision anything. You don't need to worry about anything else underneath the hood that you would typically worry about when you are trying to connect things, say, to Power BI or trying to connect things to Synapse. Everything is in one place, and it's secure and it's governed because it's deeply integrated with Microsoft Purview as well. And if we just go to our next one, which is just having that lake-centric and open approach, you have your one copy of your file. And sometimes it's really hard to conceptualize this, the fact that you have one copy of your file that's going from one place to another place to another place, but it's one copy. You're not copying it over, meaning there's no need for duplicates. It's quite rare you'd have duplicates unless you decide you want to have duplicates, but you have this one copy. And we also have this interface. So you might be a data engineer, you might be a data analyst, you might even be a citizen developer, or just someone that consumes the report. So what you could do is you could go through the different interfaces. So I'll show you in a second the different workspaces or the different workloads that we have and how they cater to each business user. So it doesn't matter if you, for instance, aren't proficient in maybe Python, or it doesn't matter if you don't necessarily know how to, we'll say, create a data model, but you do know how to cleanse data and you don't know how to connect it to Power BI. You have all of these different workloads that make this integration seamless. And like we have seen in the news as well, Microsoft recently just released some new AI functionalities. So Microsoft Fabric is deeply integrated with AI, and we'll see it in a second how it has Copilot at each and every single stage, each and every single workload. And it's just to help you, even when you are, say, typing code or when you're creating some DAX measures. And you'll see in a second as well how fast it is. And I talked about how it just works. To me, this seems almost like magic. And I say almost like magic just because it's frictionless. You don't need to provision anything. You don't need to connect anything. Everything is there for you. And you don't need to worry about, I don't know, say what file format is this coming from? What file format does this particular, I would say, application require? No, it's quite instant and it's quite frictionless. And it's also deeply integrated with everything, like I mentioned before. So this is what we typically see. So we have our one lake. So in our one lake, this is where we have our central repository for all our data. And here, this is the OneDrive. I would say. So here you have all of your data. You have your unstructured, you have your raw data, your clean data, your everything is in your OneLake. And I think about it as OneDrive because when we think about OneDrive, we have all sorts of files in OneDrive. We have pictures, we have videos, we have Word documents, we have Excel documents. And that's the same thing with OneLake. You've got all of these different things, all of these different artifacts in one place. You also have the ability to, when you go through the Microsoft Fabric data experience, so it could be as a data engineer, could be as a data analyst, it could be as a data scientist, then you have the, I'd say the capability to integrate it with things like Azure AI Studio, building on top of what you've already created and enhancing your data solution even more. And so that's the beauty with Fabric, is the fact that it just works. Like it said in the other side, it just works, similar to magic. It's just there. And I think sometimes as well, when I do speak to customers, this is a thing that I think is hard to conceptualize because it just works and it's just there and you don't need to copy data across. And it's quite a hard shift from what we're typically used to in the traditional sense of the data engineering and the data science world. It's quite a shift, but it saves up on a lot of time. So this is just how you can integrate it with your existing stack. So we have things like shortcuts in Microsoft Fabric. So in Microsoft Fabric, you can bring data from, you can just see at the bottom there, you can create some shortcuts to storage accounts that aren't even existing on your Azure platform. It could be from Amazon, it could be from Google as well. So with this term shortcuts, and I think our next slide actually will touch on it. So with this term shortcuts, what this means is, once again, going back to this sort of desktop analogy, because this is a perfect way to describe it. But in desktop, when you have a file, it can be located in your pictures, for instance. You have a file located in your pictures folder, and you don't see it on your desktop. But if you want to have access to see your pictures on your desktop, you can simply create a shortcut to that file. So you're not actually moving the file from where it exists in pictures. You're just creating a shortcut to automatically take you there. That's the same thing. So now imagine that, but across your different data sources. You can create shortcuts to your Amazon account, for instance, and all you do is, what it does is it virtualizes that data for you in your data platform. So what you do on that data, it won't affect the path data, the original data. So what tends to happen, especially in this case, and I think, okay, let me just go back. I think okay, perfect.
Yeah,
So
perfect.
fantastic. So what tends to happen in these cases where we have when we have data outside of our storage accounts? So let's take something, for example, which is, I'm sorry, is it still sharing? I don't know why. I think it keeps on coming in and
Yeah,
out.
has a slide, shortcuts, virtualized data across domains and clouds. Is that the
Okay,
one? Yeah,
that's fine. Thank you so much. That's perfect.
no problem at all.
The things on the side, is that, so no notifications on the side?
There's no notifications coming up now.
Okay, that's fantastic. Okay. Okay, great. So if we go back to virtualizing data, so when you have something outside of your storage account, when you have something outside of your storage account, what tends to happen is, say if I delete a column because I've created a shortcut and I've brought it into Microsoft Fabric. If I delete a column in my shortcut in Microsoft Fabric, it doesn't fundamentally change the actual data at the data source. But if I go to the data source and I change something in the data source, that change will be reflected to the shortcut. But what will happen as well is, say if we have a column in our shortcut, we have about 4 columns, but in our data source, we have 5 columns. So our original data has 5 columns, but we deleted 1 column in our data engineering processing. What will happen is, as our data source updates, so not existing in Microsoft Fabric, but outside of Microsoft Fabric, as it updates, it's going to update the 4 columns, but it won't bring back the 5th column that we deleted. It'll only update the 4 columns. So it's quite similar to actually bringing your data into the actual Fabric platform. And that's the beauty, I would say, with shortcuts, is you don't have to bring in anything. And it's really good as well when you're trying to mesh data, mix and mash and cleanse your data. This is really helpful because that means you don't need to actually bring things into your OneLake that you don't need to bring into. And so I keep referring back to this one lake, one lake, one lake, one lake. And it's because Fabric is one lake. Everything is centered around this one lake. And when I say OneDrive for data, when we say OneDrive, what we mean is when we look at OneDrive, for instance, we have Microsoft Word documents in there, we have Excel documents, we have pictures, we have videos, we have all sorts of things in our OneDrive. I'm sure if we all go into our OneDrive now, we'll probably find things that we didn't even know we had. And that's similar to One Lake. Hopefully, it doesn't get out of control to that extent. But with One Lake, you have this place where you have your different artifacts. So you have your data models in there. You have your data science experiments in there. You will have different Power BI reports in there. You've got different artifacts from these different workloads. Everything all exists in your One Lake. And it's one lake per tenant. So you don't need to manage all of these different one lakes. No, it'll be one lake where you have this one repository where you can store everything for your organization. You don't need to build anything. It's already provisioned for you. And like I mentioned before, it's provisioned automatically. You don't need to go into the Azure portal or do anything special. No, you don't. And it stores all of your data from all of your different workloads. And I think the beauty as well with having this particular approach is the fact that you have this one place where people can go and they can extract your workspace content, they can extract data models, they can get different things, and they don't necessarily need to move things across different tenants. They don't need to move things across different storage accounts. Everything is just in this one place. So, for instance, if we have people in this example on the screen, we have people who are in online sales, but they need to have access to customer data, or they need to have access to the customer data model or customer data science model. They could easily do that because this is all provisioned in one place. All of this is stored in one place. And once again, I keep reiterating the fact that it's built with Purview in mind, and its tight integration with Purview means it has that unified security and governance approach that you're used to with all of our other Microsoft products. And so this is just an example of some pain points. So say, for instance, we are in a very huge organization, we're a very successful company, and we have data engineers, we have data scientists, we have data analysts, we also have our consumers of our reports and our data stewards. So our data engineers, typically what we see is our data engineers are exhausted because it's data engineering. And once they clean the data, once they bring in the data, now they have to think about, okay, so what data is relevant for the data scientist? How do we clean this particular data set just for the data scientist? It's also quite expensive as well when you're trying to do all of those different configurations, deploying these different things, buying these additional licenses. And sometimes what tends to happen is we buy these licenses, we don't even use them. And also data latency is important because if our data scientists need to create data models, they need to have access to real, I wouldn't say real-time data because it does depend on the use case, but they need to have data that is up to date. And so that's where we have our data scientists also complaining because our data scientists feel like they're working in a silo development. So by the time they've built these models or built whatever they do need to build, it might not even be relevant, or it might be stale at the source because the data engineers haven't yet cleansed a particular set of data for them to use. And then this carries over to our data analysts. So when you look at our data analysts as well, they can't get the right insights because the data is stale, the data is old, the data might not be clean. Like we say in AI, or when it comes to machine learning or any natural language processing, is garbage in, garbage out. So from the beginning, it's not necessarily garbage, but then the quality is quite low. And as we start to go down data engineer, data scientist, data analyst, the quality just gets worse and worse and worse. And because of that, we have bad insights, and it means our stakeholders aren't happy. They're not happy with the reports. They're not accurately reflecting what is in the system. And there's no actual way of making this real time or making this up to date. Because maybe you might find in some systems the data only updates every 24 hours. But sometimes things happen, and we need to see the data after, say, 10 hours. And so this is where Microsoft Fabric comes into play. So we have our data engineers. So with our data engineers, they're supported by Data Factory, data warehousing, the data engineering experience, real-time intelligence as well. And so when we look at Data Factory, data warehousing, data engineering, when we kind of take a step back, and we look at 4 years ago, these things were all in different places and you had to configure them. And so now when we have our data engineers using these tools that are deeply integrated with data science, with Power BI, all they have to do is cleanse the data and leave it in your one lake. The data scientist can then go and say, oh, the data is clean. Now I can actually use the data. The data scientist would then go in, use the data, build their models, and then the data analyst to go in, oh, so the models have been created, the data has been cleaned. Now let me build the models. And then our consumers can then decide to consume it, however they do decide to consume it, whether it's typically Power BI or whether it's a web application, they'll consume it the same way. Another thing I do want to mention is when it comes to each of these services, these are all the different 7 workloads, but at the same time, the rules of the game, like I like to say, the rules of the game are still the same. So with Power BI, we still have the, oh, you can embed this report into something, you can serve this report as this. So we have that as well. And then with our data analysts, same thing, they still have access to data warehousing. It's still the same experience as you would in, say, Azure Synapse Analytics, for instance. It's still the same. The only difference is it's been enhanced now with that AI capability. And this is just an example of what you could typically see with Fabric. So maybe an end-to-end solution. So say we are, once again, a very successful retail company, very successful. But as a retail company in real life, we tend to see companies that have different data across different data platforms. So we could have Amazon, we have Azure here, Dataverse as well. What we can do is instead of us bringing all of that into our one lake, we could bring it into our one lake, but at the same time, we could also create shortcuts. So maybe we've created a shortcut to our Amazon account. From there, we can take it into our data integration, data warehousing solution. So this is where our data engineers are now ingesting the data, cleaning the data, meshing the data, mashing the data. Do we need this column? Do we need that column? The medallion architecture is being created at this instance. Then our data engineers can then transform this data. So here in this case, it's sensor data that shows foot traffic into the store at peak shopping times. So then we can transform that so our data scientists can then build models that can help us predict store traffic in different scenarios at different times of the day so we can monitor behavior. So that takes us to our different experience of Fabric, which is then our data science experience. Then we can also use our real-time intelligence capabilities where you can look at this data real-time, so streaming. So if you have used streaming data sets before, very similar to that, streaming data is coming in and it's live, and then you can push it into Power BI. And in Power BI, you'll be able to visualize these things at blazing speeds, and you can consume these as well in different reports. So here we have Power Platform, D365, M365, or a web application, or it could be wherever you tend to consume your reports. But this is typically what we see end to end. And when we talk about the 7 different workloads as well, this is what we're referring to. So we have our data factory. So we saw there how we have our data engineers, we have our data analysts, and how they might take advantage of each of these different workloads. So with data factory, we have this place, I'll say, for now, we'll say this magical place where we get to ingest our data, we can mash our data, we can mix our data from different data sources, whether it's in our one lake or it's in our shortcuts. We can bring in our data. From our data engineers' point of view, they can then build, design, maintain the infrastructures that, just like they would in any other application. Then in our data warehousing solutions, this is where now we're performing maybe we're doing some SQL queries. This is when we're querying our data. And we also have our data scientists as well who can explore that workload, which is just, creating the data model, similar to Azure Machine Learning Workspaces, a very similar experience if you are used to that. And then we have our Power BI where it's deeply integrated with all of these different features. So you'd find that if someone makes a change at the data factory level or makes a change at the data engineering level, it'll quickly be reflected into Power BI. And that's the beauty with having this one copy approach. And I think actually to put this into perspective, the way I can describe this is when you have a Word document and you're all collaborating on a Word document, you don't have to copy the Word document from this person's OneDrive to this other person's OneDrive. No, as long as they have access to the actual document, each of you can edit that document and the changes will be reflected in real time. Maybe it might take, in the real world, it'll probably take a few seconds. So maybe it might take a few seconds, but this is one copy that you're working on, almost like a shared document, which is amazing when you think about it, because we're doing this with billions and millions and rows of data. And so we go into our data factory workload. And all of these workloads correspond to the different workspaces as well. So we have our data factory workload. Like I mentioned before, this is where you can mash up your data. You can bring in your data from your different data sources. And our data engineers from there, they can either use the low code approach, or if they're proficient in any particular coding language as well, because it is quite open, so you can use different languages. But if they did want to clean the data, cleanse the data, do some transformations, using that notebook-like experience, write some code, they can do that. And then we can take it into our data warehousing solution. From our data warehousing solution, our data scientists can then build models. So like we saw before in the retail example, we could build models that could predict foot traffic into a store, or we can build models that can predict where we might be financially in the next few years. And mind you, all of this is happening on one copy of the data, one copy. And then we can deeply integrate this as well with real-time intelligence, so we can capture these things as they happen and as the data is being cleansed. And then we can visualize this into Power BI, just like you would in any other normal Power BI report. You have your direct query. Actually, that is another interesting topic to touch on. I think I'm getting too excited there, so I won't touch on it just now because it's in the next few slides. But these are the main workloads of Power BI. And Copilot will be at each and every single layer of these workloads and of these stages. So you have Copilot in Data Factory, Copilot in Data Engineering, Copilot in Data Warehouse, and across the board. And it's simple things like asking Power BI to create a report that looks similar to the other reports that you've generated for your organization. It's other things like in data engineering, IntelliSense, if you've used IntelliSense before, having it auto kind of populate what you might say next, or asking it to help you create some code to do certain things. And so that's why Copilot is infused into Microsoft Fabric at each layer. And also OneLake as well, because we touched on this one copy of the data. I think for me, something that I really enjoy about Microsoft Fabric is the fact that it's one copy of the data being spread across these 7 different workloads. That's incredible to me, especially coming from the times of having to connect my Azure Machine Learning workspace to my Power BI report just to visualize some data. That's mind blowing. And I'm not just saying that because I really love Fabric. And once again, it's this deep integration with Purview. So at the same time, we have all of these beautiful, amazing things that we can do with Fabric. But let's always have security in mind. Let's always have governance in mind. And so Microsoft keeps that and takes that into consideration, even at each layer. So it's similar to if you've used Power BI before, you know we have Power BI workspace admins, we have our Power BI tenants. Same thing, the rules of the game are still the same. We still have the same security and governance, and you can still modify it for your particular use case, because some industries might be more sensitive than other industries, for instance. Or maybe you want people to not have access to see certain things in your OneLake. Those are some things as well that you can consider. And I talked about the different personas, the different workloads. This is what it would look like if you go into Microsoft Fabric. These are the different workloads that we have. So the first one at the back there, you might be familiar with Microsoft Power BI. If you are, Microsoft Power BI works the same thing. You can visualize your data. And then here we have our data factory, we have data science, our data warehousing. And these are just the different personas that we talked through. But as you can see, each one of them look the same. But I know it is small, so you might not be able to see it, but these icons change depending on which persona you will switch to. And if you just go to the bottom of the screen, you can actually flip between the different persona workloads as well. And so we talked about Microsoft Power BI. And for me, out of everything Fabric, this has to be I would say the most amazing thing that has come out of Fabric, or one of the most amazing things that's come out of Fabric, is this Power BI service and integration between our data warehousing and our lakehouse. Because anyone that has used Microsoft Power BI, you find trying to connect them sometimes can be problematic. Sometimes it can be tedious as well. It can also be a problem if you have certain restrictions, for example, permissions, networking. But no, now it's all in one place. And another thing that I wanted to talk about, or one of the most exciting features that we now have in Fabric, is this direct link mode approach. So if you have used Power BI before, you do know we have direct query and we have import mode. So with direct query, we are able to query our data at the source. So we're not necessarily bringing our data into Power BI, but we're just querying it at the source. And that's great when you do need data to be I would say fresh, and you don't want to wait for 24 hours per se to update your data. But the problem with using direct query sometimes is performance. Because you're querying your data at your source, that can hinder your performance, and things might be slow, things might, I wouldn't necessarily say break, but things might just be slow. But at the same time, when we look at import mode, which is our other mode to use data in Power BI, with import mode, performance is great. Performance is great. With import mode, you're bringing your data into Power BI. But because you're bringing your data into Power BI, that again could be storage wise, it could not be the best in terms of storage wise. And so you have each of these different trade offs. So with import mode, you have the fact that it's fast. But with direct query, it's fresh. So it's almost like you had to pick between which one you wanted and which problem was, or which would be the lesser evil. But now with Fabric, we have this direct link mode approach. And I don't mean to be that person, but actually talking about it does give me goosebumps, because this is something that's been needed in the sense of we now have the best of both worlds. So we have the speed of direct query. We have the not, sorry, not the speed, but we have the speed of import mode. But at the same time, we also have the performance of import mode. But at the same time, we also have that we're not using our storage per se. We're not bringing in something and our data is stale. No, it's fresh, its performance is quite fast as well, and it just brings all of the benefits and the advantages of both direct query and import mode into one, and it makes it fast and real-time data. That would be the resulting of everything. And that's why we have down here, you can query your data. And I just didn't add any videos, but there's a beautiful video on YouTube that actually shows you how fast it is. They were bringing in, I think it was about 3 billion rows of data, and Power BI was able to load that and change visualizations in about less than 4 seconds, which is amazing. Because if you come from the traditional BI world, trying to use Power BI, trying to load 4 billions of rows of data, you might find it might take a while, whether it's direct query, import mode, it would be problematic just because of the space. Okay, and so we have talked about Copilot quite a bit. And with Fabric as well, it is the bridge between AI and analytics. That's the way I like to think about it. And we did talk about the fact that Copilot is infused at each and every single layer of Microsoft Fabric. And I just go to our next slide. So when we talk about the different things we can do in Copilot, we can do many different things with Copilot in Fabric. So in Power BI, for instance, we can ask Power BI, even though it's obviously best to create your reports yourself in case you do have any modifications. And Copilot is a Copilot for a reason, because you also need to be a human in the loop to make sure it's doing the right things. So with our Copilot infused with Power BI, what we could simply do is ask Power BI to create for us a report. Or we can say, Power BI, create us some DAX queries that do X, Y, and Z. So you still need to know DAX. I would still highly recommend knowing DAX. Always highly recommend knowing DAX. But at the same time, Copilot is there. And just like IntelliSense, you might have used GitHub as well. GitHub that can automatically fill up what you wanted to do or predict what you might want it to do. That's the same thing with Power BI when it comes to DAX. What I will say with this is garbage in, garbage out. So when it comes to, I'll say, Power BI specifically, and it's across the board as well, but I'm just talking in regards to Power BI, it's really, really important that you have your data model, you have your data model accurately modeled. Because if it's garbage in, garbage out, you might find that you might be asking Copilot to create a DAX measure based off some data, but then the data model is inaccurate. So it will fail to actually create what you wanted to create. As a result, the insights will be bad. or your values might not be correct. And it's the same thing with data science. You need to make sure your data is clean. You need to make sure that you're doing things correctly as well. Because with data science, if we ask Copilot to help us, say, create some queries so we can do X, Y, and Z with our data model, it needs to make sure the data at the source, going back to data factory as well, is clean. And so, like I mentioned before, it's deeply integrated with generative AI. There's AI-driven insights as well. So it's simple things like in one of the workload workspaces as well. You might not know how to code in Python, but if you don't know how to code in Python, that's still fine because there's a low-code approach to the Python approach of cleansing your data. And that's another thing which is beautiful, I'd say, about Fabric is when we say it's empowering every business user, it is empowering every business user because you're no longer just restrained to having only the data engineers do this, only the data analysts do this. No, this promotes collaboration across the team. At the same time, the room for error reduces significantly because we are humans, so there still will be errors. There still will be errors because we are humans. But at the same time, the room for errors just significantly reduces. And like I mentioned before, Copilot is integrated at each and every single experience. So it doesn't matter if you're a data analyst, it doesn't matter if you're a data engineer or data scientist, it's infused at each and every single layer. So if we look at data science, for instance, so at data science level, we have here, it's quite small text, but you might be asking Copilot to generate some, could be a column, or it could be, you could ask it, what does this particular formula mean? Or where is this data coming from? But exactly how you would ask something like a chat GPT is the way that you would utilize Copilot. Same thing with data warehousing. It can actually also complete your it can complete your code for you as well with data science, real-time intelligence, and Power BI. So, like I mentioned before, all of these things are great, but this wouldn't be a good product if we didn't take into account security, if we didn't take into account governance as well. And so, when we look across the board, because of its tight integration with Microsoft Purview, we have things here like lineage. And we can monitor how our data is being used. If you've used Power BI, you might be familiar with the data lineage view. You might be aware of the impact analysis as well. So it's things like that, but it takes it across your different workloads. That is powerful. The fact that it's across your different workloads. And it takes still as well the same things as Purview, which is your Purview hub, your monitoring hub, capacity metrics, admin monitoring, Purview audit, all of the things that you're used to in each of the different workloads separately. So in Azure Machine Learning, you might be used to certain security measures. Yes, those will follow you into Fabric. The rules of the game don't change. It's just the fact that collaboration is easier and the room for error significantly reduces. And so when we talk about licensing as well, I won't go into the exact specifics because obviously it is user dependent. It is user dependent. But at the same time, we have talked about how this is a unified platform. And when you pay for this tool or when you get a license to this tool, it's not just one singular tool like we're used in traditional data engineering and data analysis. No, you're not just paying for one, but you're actually paying for seven, which is amazing when you think about it. And you have access to all of these different things, and you have access to security. You've got access to the different computes, to the different models as well. And when we look at the way that the licenses are structured, so we obviously have our compute. So like I mentioned before, in Azure Synapse Analytics, we have things like dedicated compute, we have serverless compute, same thing. Same thing here. So we have different compute powers here, and then we also have storage. So that's where that the licenses would typically appear or show up. So those would be the two ways that you could provision your license. And there's different types of licensing. So we have, for the storage, is pay as you go, a single place. So maybe you might not have lots of data to begin with, but maybe you might do later on. Okay, that's fine. You can pay as you go. For compute as well, you can do 1 year reservation. Obviously, I'll say between pay as you go and the 1 year reservation is you have dedicated capacity to you. So if you have used Microsoft Synapse Analytics, you'll be familiar with the fact that when you have dedicated compute capacity reserved just for you, things might be faster. You don't have to wait for, I would say, some compute to open up if you're sharing capacity with different people. No, it's dedicated just to you. And so it depends on what you want and on your use cases as well. And another thing to just make a mention of is we do have weekly Fabric releases. So just stay up to date with, okay, let me just go back. Can you still see the slides okay? I think it might be paused. Okay, regardless, anyway, we are done with the slides. So what I will say is weekly, we have weekly releases as well with Microsoft Fabric. We also have a blog that you can keep up to date with. We recently had builds, so there've been some new announcements that have been made. And you can also get started with the Microsoft Learn Pass. I'm just trying to think of all of the things that could help you get started. There's some really useful YouTube videos as well. So in as much as we do update our content, we do update some blogs. If you're someone that enjoys learning through videos, sometimes I enjoy learning through videos, you can do the same thing as well. And I
Thank
think on
you.
that note, I will
Yeah,
on the floor.
thanks, Tinga, for a great presentation. So now we'll get into the questions and answers part. Should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type in the questions box now. So our first question is there a separate license for nonprofit organizations?
Okay, that is a very good question. Perhaps you could reach out to a Microsoft, I would say a Microsoft, not necessarily a Microsoft partner, but you could reach out to a Microsoft representative and we could talk about that.
Perfect. So just the next one is, how is the IAM organized throughout the whole process of data flow? If I'm using SSO and Azure AD, accessing the Azure portal and my data is located in Azure ML Studio and from Data Lake Gen to Azure Blob Storage, how should I configure and ensure the access control of all the interfaces within Data Fabric so that I can use my data in Power BI and also grant a report to others?
Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, this should be a question about accessing and permissions. So what we do have is if you have used Power BI, so you might be familiar with Power BI tenant settings. So it's similar to that. You can grant access to people to see certain things or restrict access to people, but that would be at tenant level where you can do that. Or you could also do it at workspace level. If you have permissions, it depends if you're the tenant or not, but it will still be the same in terms of granting access. So if I say grant access to a particular data source, or in Power BI, we call it row level security. So if I implement row level security, meaning I'm restricting data from certain people, it will still apply even if you are using Microsoft Fabric.
Amazing. So just the next question there is Microsoft Fabric adding additional boundary protection and limitation of the data access, or is Fabric providing any managed services to streamline the data flow from end to end?
Don't think I quite understood that question. Would you be
Okay.
able to?
Yeah, they might put in another
Yes.
elaborate on the question, but we'll just get on to the next one. Um, what future developments and enhancements are planned for Microsoft Fabric? Do you know?
Oh, that is a good one. That is a good one. So we have our Microsoft roadmap. Firstly, before I even start to talk, we have the Microsoft roadmap, which actually shows you some things that will be coming up in preview. Like I mentioned before, because things are dropping weekly, weekly. So I'll say recently, for instance, we recently enabled the Copilot feature to be turned on for all tenants. So I would say keep an eye out on the blogs, but what I do see is more integrations with AI, especially in the time intelligence space, because that was just recently announced at Build a few days ago.
Perfect. So that's the next question in there is there a community or forum where users can share knowledge and best practices related to Microsoft Fabric?
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. I don't know if I could type, but uh, I don't really know how I could communicate. But essentially, if you do go into Bing, I won't say Google, if you do go into Bing and you type in, I think the Microsoft blog, there is a forum. I believe it could be a Fabric forum now. It will either be Power BI or a Fabric forum, but it should be there when you go to the Microsoft blog. It'll redirect you to a forum where people just share queries as well.
So that person just added to that question before.
Okay.
He just goes, I mean, besides the inside services encapsulated in data fabric, does the wrapper data fabric provide additional boundary protection of the data or um, a, uh, data or additional managed identities to automatically streamline the data flow? Does that make sense?
Still similar. I'd have to take that with me. I'll take
Okay,
that with me. Yes.
perfect. So I think just the last question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, will there be a DevOps component in Fabric? Any plans integrating Azure DevOps into Fabric?
Yes, yes, there are plans. I will check on the blog because I'm conscious not to say anything too sensitive. But yes, it is quite tightly integrated with DevOps, and I do see it going that direction. So it's how I do know this as well. It could be already integrated, or it is just because Power BI, I do know recently came up with Power BI projects as well, just to help the integration with DevOps. So yes.
Perfect. So I think that's all the questions. So on behalf of the ESBC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Changa, for taking the time today to carry this webinar. We really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the questions.
Amazing. So that's the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again to you all for joining us today, and I hope you join us again soon. Take care.
Thank you.